Hello and welcome to a special edition of the President's Podcast right here on The Record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Senate Republican Caucus, the Majority Caucus in the Ohio Senate. Our special edition today features excerpts from three of our most recent podcasts, including respected election law attorney and national redistricting expert Frank Strigari. Also, Chairman of the Ohio Redistricting Commission and current state auditor, former Senate President Keith Faber, current Senate President Matt Huffman. But we begin with the chair and co-chair of the Ohio Ballot Board, Frank LaRose, and State Senator Theresa Gavarone.
And here's the most cynical part of this. What lies at the heart of this entire effort, and again, incredibly cynical, is this idea that there should be a certain number of Republicans in the General Assembly and a certain number of Democrats in the General Assembly, and that they're going to gerrymander the districts to accomplish that preconceived certain number of districts for Republicans and Democrats. What an undemocratic idea. Right. Because it's up to the people. That is gerrymandering. It's the textbook definition of it.
Right, and unlimited splits in communities of cities, townships, county splits.
And unequal districts population-wise as well. There's no requirement within this system, within this proposal, that says districts need to be equal population. So you could have a large district and a much smaller district, and really that undermines the whole idea of one person, one vote. And they like to call it proportionality or representational fairness, which basically equals fixed outcomes and is the purest definition of gerrymandering.
Absolutely, which is why we changed the language.
Which was also interesting because it really received some pushback, because the language from the Secretary of State's office talked about how they wanted to draw or manipulate the map. You made a motion and it was accepted and passed on a 3-2 vote to change the word manipulate to gerrymandering.
Which is exactly what this is. And if you look it up in the dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary, this is the very definition of gerrymandering. So let's tell the people what this really is.
And I supported that motion because it states very clearly what this is. Manipulating districts to achieve a political outcome is the Oxford Dictionary definition of gerrymandering. So let's replace that with the word that's in common usage. But then some of the members of the ballot board were complaining that that's an unfair word, or that's a word that has a negative connotation. But then we started looking through the actual amendment language that their side proposed, and that includes the word gerrymander. So they're actually using the word gerrymander in their proposed amendment, but for us to use it in the ballot language is somehow off limits. I think that's a pretty wild idea.
Also, a part of what was being discussed was what was being omitted, or what had been omitted from the Citizens Not Politicians ballot summary that they suggested. There is a Ohio Supreme Court case that the current face of the Citizens Not Politicians campaign, former Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor, she concurred with on a 6-1 vote. It's called Voters First, and it made very clear that voters have a right to know exactly what they're voting on, and it uses a term called materially omitting something. In other words, I would call it improperly ignoring, maybe illegally ignoring. And there seemed to be a lot of subject matter that was improperly or materially ignored, starting with, as you mentioned, how we come up with the 15 people on the commission from a group of 90 people. And part of what you changed in your initial summary coming from the Secretary of State's office was how the board was developed, all the way down to exactly what criteria will be used, like we have right now, that limits how many times that you can split a municipality, that provides compact districts. There's strict rules right now with the redistricting process that we all live under right now that says you cannot split towns and communities and political subdivisions more than one time or no times. So it's resulted in compact communities of interest. So there seemed to be a lot that was materially omitted, or as I like to say, improperly ignored.
Well, and it's disappointing, but not surprising, that at the time Justice O'Connor would author a decision on the Ohio Supreme Court that establishes rules for certain people, but not for her, and that once she is, backing a cause, those just get ignored.
One of the things about materially omitting part of this very lengthy ballot proposal. The approved ballot language said nothing about who will be selecting the commission members. I mean, how do you get to selecting the group of retired judges that are supposed to then institute the guardrails around how we select 90 people? I mean, the chicken or the egg first? It's very unclear and maybe ambiguously so. It was written that way, so it provided some leeway for them to kind of make it up as they went along.
Let's contrast that with who chooses the current redistricting commission members. Very clear.
Accountability.
The people of Ohio
voters.
choose the current. And so some would say, but their districts are skewed. Well, not the, perhaps, I guess I don't agree with that, but the boundary lines of Ohio have been in place for well over 200 years. And so there's 3 of us on that commission that are elected statewide. And by the way, all 3 of us are Republicans because that's who the voters have chosen. So the current process relies on the voters choosing who's going to serve on the redistricting commission. This new process is this, again, a Rube Goldberg, very convoluted, perhaps intentionally convoluted process for how do you come up with these 15 individuals that are going to be, ordained by these retired judges to do this work and not have any political opinions about it whatsoever. It's a foolish notion. Sorry.
And the elected officials are accountable to the voters.
Yeah.
If the voters don't like the way these lines are drawn, they can vote you out.
Sure. By the way,
Under
which
this-
they didn't take the opportunity to do when they had the chance to do that, right? So
Absolutely. But under this plan, the voters have no say.
It's a horrible idea. I'll start out with that. When you try and take politics out of an inherently political process, you end up with worse problems. And this organization is not apolitical. It has a very clear political leftist bent. They're all funded by the same funders. They all have the same support. And because they're not putting elected officials on there, doesn't mean they're not putting political people on there. I ask a rhetorical question. Who wants to serve on a redistricting commission if you have no interest in politics or no interest in political outcomes? Good luck finding people who have that model. They're not going to go out and just draft people from the citizenry. So the people who are going to apply for those positions all have their own political leanings. And their rules have cut out most anybody who would have a knowledge of what the impacts and other impacts are outside of the political organizations that are going to be feeding people in the organization, like the League of Women Voters. And so that's part of the problem. But the bigger problem is how is this going to work and what is the outcome? This is a very narrowly tailored process to lead to progressive political outcomes. If you look at the states where something like this has been done, almost always the final outcome is more progressive elected officials and fewer conservatives. It is a political outcome that is designed to hurt Ohio.
And Michigan found that out on their own a few months ago by violating the Federal Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, one of the ways that this is designed, and again, Keith hit it on the head, that progressive left-leaning folks can get their people into office. One of those ways is to take a portion of an inner city urban district and sort of pinwheel it out into the suburbs, and the folks in the suburbs get elected. And inevitably, what that leads to is African American legislators losing their seats. And, all political parties are made up of various factions. And by and large, most African American legislators are socially conservative. We may not call them conservatives in terms of other things that they vote on, but that's where their position is. The folks doing this are not interested in their views. What they're interested in is their progressive leftist power that they will have. And so folks may say, well, that's just Huffman. He's been involved in this for a long time. This just happened in Michigan. Same plan, same map. The African American legislators sued, saying this violated the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and they won. The federal court said, yes, you did. You'll be hearing from those people during this campaign and other folks. So this is never about fair maps. This is never about gerrymandering, except that we would like to gerrymander these maps so that we get what we want. It's really odd that the League of Women Voters is one of the groups pushing this, because they were one of the groups pushing the 2015 and 18 reforms, which we all endorsed and and passed overwhelmingly. So it must be a new set of people in charge of the League of Women Voters. But, you know, the other interesting thing, the fascinating thing is, of course, the Supreme Court sort of blew this up, didn't allow it to go forward in 21 and 22. Once the Supreme Court did not interject in 23, this passed by a unanimous bipartisan vote on a obviously a very hot political topic last year. Now, tell me anywhere in the United States where that has happened on such a topic, and it hasn't. So
The president's right. Under the rules, if not implemented or interfered with by a clearly activist former Supreme Court, you would have had agreement and you would have had a deal. When we came at it, unfortunately, they were crazy enough to pick me as the chairman. We got a 7-0 vote. And we got a 7-0 vote because everybody understood the risk, like the current constitutional provisions require. Everybody has to manage risk. But if you recall, during the first version of the redistricting attempts, you know, the ones that went back and forth to the court, it was very clear that the Supreme Court at the time, the majority of the court, led by the lady who's pushing this, clearly said, until the Democrats sign off on it, we're not going to give anybody what they want, and we're going to continue to keep this active in the courts. That was clearly the impression everybody
And that's not
had.
what the law says.
It is not. There is a very clear provision that, you know, look, they had the right to interpret it. They did. I think they got it wrong. I have the right to say I think they got it wrong. Having said all of that, it was amazing. Once the allied liberal groups and their friends thought that they weren't guaranteed an outcome from the Supreme Court to challenge until the cows come home, well, we had compromise. And that's what the process was originally envisioned to do, is to give everybody a right to have risk. And when you negotiate with risk involved, you tend to get a compromise. When people view the risk of saying yes outweighed by the benefits of saying no, you almost always get people saying no for political reasons or for whatever the thing is. And we had that directly. I was told by Democrats on the Redistricting Commission, and I said this in my deposition, we won't agree to a negotiated outcome as long as X or Y. And that is the circumstance that leads to them wanting a court challenge. They thought they would do better in the courts no matter what the deal was.
It's amazing when the NDRC, the Fair Districts groups, or as I like to call them, the Unfair Districts groups, and the League of Liberal Misinformation were removed from the process and let the commission actually do the work. 7-0 vote that produced the most compact maps in really the history of Ohio.
yeah, not only the maps were more compact, it's easier to govern. Those were the things that we put in the 2015 reform, which dealt with the General Assembly. We're not dividing up communities. We don't have elongated districts. And really, most of state government is administered at the county or local level. And that's why it's easier to know who your state rep or state senator is. That was part of the importance of the 2015 reform. The 2018 reform was the congressional reform. And of course, the map we passed pursuant to that constitutional process, that ultimately was appealed to the Supreme Court by these leftist groups. Now, once the court decided the North Carolina case and said, no, the states can do that, they can take politics in, that case was remanded back to the Ohio Supreme Court in 23 to say, read what we said in North Carolina. You redecide what we said under the previous Supreme Court.
In other words, you got it wrong.
You got it wrong, and so look at this and make a decision. Well, what did the leftist groups do? They dismissed the case. And the reason they gave for that is, well, we think there's been enough litigation. That's ridiculous. They dismissed the case on the congressional redistricting because they were going to lose. And so the answer is, if we want voters and their elected officials to make decisions versus judges, which is to make these political and policy decisions, then we have to let them do it. Otherwise, somebody in a robe someplace is going to make all your decisions for you.
And I thought it was very interesting, too, that regarding the maps for the General Assembly, the federal court, I believe was on page 78, and it's fairly easy to find, talked about the 4-3 majority at the time basing its ruling on standards, quote, not easily found anywhere in the Constitution. Translated, it's not found in the Constitution anywhere.
Look, when we pushed and the voters approved and both President Huffman and myself were involved in drafting these provisions. When we did those things, our fundamental, overarching, bipartisan, fundamental basis for putting that in the Constitution and our overarching guidelines were really this. We wanted compact districts that allowed people to be represented by people who they knew and trusted. If you go to hub and spoke districts like President Huffman mentioned, which is what this proposal calls for, so that you can get a desired political outcome, that's called gerrymandering. And ultimately, the proposal that's in law now limits your ability to do that. It requires you to keep communities together, to draw compact districts, and that's going to allow people to be represented by people who share their interests and values. That's the current system. The new system will give you some kind of a political outcome to balance, and it's going to have people represented by people who have no idea how they can share their beliefs and values, because candidly, you're going for a political outcome. You're not going for community representation and keeping things compact.
Right, and the short version of that is have the court draw the map. Recently, the head of the League of Women Voters in Ohio was on the Then What Happened podcast from the Columbus Dispatch. It was an interesting conversation. Jen Miller said the following, quote, "But at the end of the day, there was no ability, no explicit ability for the Supreme Court to draw their own maps or get their own special mapping masters. We have that now." And she's referring to this flow chart. Basically, having the court draw the maps through the whole process and then rule on said map. Why would the General Assembly, a separate branch of government, ever want the judicial branch to legislate what the political districts would be for the General Assembly? Isn't that judicial activism? Why would the judiciary be involved in legislating maps for the GA?
And when that person says there's no explicit authority to them to do that, there is an explicit ban on the Supreme Court doing that. Constitutional reforms that were put in 2015 said the Supreme Court shall not draw any map or district. And that was specifically part of the reform. And of course, lots of states, those kinds of things were happening. They'd go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. We wanted to make that clear. And one of the reasons that was important is what Keith just mentioned. The people at the table had a series of incentives and penalties, both the majority and minority under the current system. And essentially, we had folks sitting around the table saying, well, in the past, 2010 and 2010 and 2000, Republicans could just say, here's the map, we followed civil rights, federal law, we're going to do what we want. In 1990 and 1980 and 1970, that was the Democrats doing the same thing. The new program said, look, it's probably better for us to give the minority somewhat what they want. And the minority party, who always voted no, well, if we do some of the things the majority, we can vote yes. It was the compromise, it was the working together that everybody says they want, but ultimately when it happens, folks like this are saying, give me more of what I want and less of a compromised, let's all talk about it together situation.
This concept of representational fairness is a nebulous concept. It's always a shifting goal, and it's what you want under the terms to meet your own political agenda, and that's why it doesn't work. And if you go back to the fundamental truism that in Ohio, people want to be represented by people who share their values and share their beliefs. And in Ohio, for the most part, people tend to live around people who think and vote like them. And if you want to divide that up to hit some political statewide proportionality, you're, by the very, very nature of that, going to have an awful lot of people in Ohio represented by somebody who doesn't share their thoughts and beliefs. And that's the outcome of this proposal.
And as I think the president said in an earlier podcast, the legislature doesn't tell the judicial branch how to rule on cases.
Well, yeah, I had some folks say, well, hey, when the Supreme Court ordered the Redistricting Commission, and by the way, we tried several times and did meet what they did, even though we're not required to do that, but ultimately would not pass a map, which apparently they needed to have. Well, that's a little bit like the legislature passing a law that says, Supreme Court, you shall issue this opinion. Well, we can't do that. and nor can the Supreme Court order us to pass a law. So, we went through this. It was really a terrible process, and frankly, for everybody involved in 21 and 22. We did our best to do what the Supreme Court said, and twice redrew our map and complied with their opinion. Then their map maker looked at it and said, we're still not going to elect enough leftist Democrats. Give them another order. Well, ultimately, again, once we got past all of that, everybody sat down at the table. Not everybody got what they want, including some not real happy Republicans in some of the bigger counties. But we ultimately got a map and unanimous bipartisan vote.
It's interesting to me that the only place you see the progressives and the leftists doing this kind of proposal are in red states. You don't see this in New York. You don't see this in New Jersey. You don't see this in other places.
California.
That ought to tell you more about what you are seeking, and what they're seeking is an outcome. They want an outcome. They really don't care how the process is to get them to that outcome, despite what they're going to say.
Yeah, in Maryland, for example, which is about a 60-40 Democrat-Republican state, they recently had a Republican governor, Larry Hogan. 7 out of their 8 congressional representatives are Democrats, which is 87% or so. The Republican Party in Maryland contacted Eric Holder and said, we think we have some gerrymandering here. Can your group come in and sue for us? And apparently their calls weren't returned. So this is about political power. It's about going to the places where they think that they can win. Because Ohio is a 50% plus 1 constitutional state. It's a big state with a lot of congressional seats. That's where they want to come in and spend their money.
If you have money, put yourself on the ballot.
The way this amendment would operate is it would end up in a commission that consists of 15 individual citizens off the streets. How you get there, of course, is, that's where almost half of the amendment consists of, like, how you get to the point of having those 15. But what is very strikingly, I think, rubbing a lot of people the wrong way is the various groups of classes of people who are excluded. And it's not just and I don't think it's anybody because the elected officials are excluded. It's the attachment of the family members of any of those individuals. It's certain officers that are out there, that at the federal, state, local level, that the language clearly is including.
Law enforcement.
Yeah, that is clear. Yeah,
military.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's clearly. I think people are starting to understand that, learn that more now. And as that information starts coming out there, I think there's going to be a lot more questions that get answered. Or I'm sorry, a lot more questions that get asked.
Well, millions of people will be excluded then, because there's.
We don't even know what that number is yet at this point. Well, honestly,
yeah, right.
But it's a lot of people.
Correct, and to think that if you're a family member of a military service man or woman, that you couldn't volunteer your time or even submit your name to, hey, I think this might be a worthwhile process, and you're immediately excluded because your loved one volunteered to serve his or her country. How exclusionary and discriminatory is that at a foundational level?
I don't understand why that would even be possible, to be honest with you. And I know that certain people are saying on the other side that that's not the case. But I think as people are, like I said, as people are continuing to take a closer look at this language, they're seeing that it's going to exclude a lot more people than anyone, honestly, is suggesting that it does.
Well, let's take a look at the approved language. We'll dive right in with the first 2 points that we've talked a little bit about here. But it says, point number 1, repeal constitutional protections against gerrymandering approved by nearly 3/4 of Ohio electors participating in the statewide elections of 2015 and 2018, and eliminate the long-standing ability of Ohio citizens to hold their representatives accountable for establishing fair state legislative and congressional districts. That seems accurate to me.
I would suggest and ask somebody what is inaccurate about that statement.
Yeah.
Okay?
What exactly?
And it's not. They don't like. This goes back to the court case from last year. They might not have written it that way themselves, the advocates, if they wanted to, and if they had the ability to do the ballot language. But just because it's not worded in a way that they didn't like it. The court has told us, so long as it's accurate, that's all that matters. And again, I would challenge someone to say, tell me how that specific language or any language in that thing is inaccurate.
Well, specifically about challenging your elected officials, because we've said repeatedly on this program that if you want to boil it down, here's the way I boil it down. Fixed outcomes, zero accountability, attack on democracy. Attack on democracy repeals the 2015 and 2018 provisions that Ohio voters approved for redistricting. Zero accountability, well, this panel, once it dissolves, it disappears into the ether, it disappears forever, and Ohio voters can't complain to the governor, secretary of state, state auditor, or members of the General Assembly that serve on the redistricting commission, because there's nobody to complain to, because the elected officials were removed entirely by what this process, which I've been calling basically a fourth branch of government, overseen by the judicial branch of government. It's kind of its own untouchable deep state bureaucracy. So it seems like point one is well taken here.
I don't. It's an interesting point that you just said, because I was just thinking about, like, if somebody wanted to go complain about one of those 15 individuals, who do they go to? I mean, because there's nobody to specifically, account for a particular person on there, which is the most fascinating thing about all of it, is that it's like, as they're trying to remove, as they say, politicians out of the process, they're removing voters out of the entire process. That's what they're doing, because voters and the citizens of the state have nobody to honestly go try to air their grievances with if they've got a grievance with anyone on that commission.
Yeah, it maybe is a First Amendment type of an issue as well, when the voters don't have a voice. Point two, establish a new taxpayer-funded commission of appointees required to gerrymander. That's the word that was replaced by the board instead of manipulate that Frank was talking about. Gerrymander the boundaries of state legislative and congressional districts to favor either of the two largest political parties in the state of Ohio, according to a formula based on partisan outcomes as the dominant factor, so that state legislative and congressional districts will no longer be required to be compact, and counties, townships, and cities throughout Ohio can be split and divided across multiple districts. Preserving communities of interest will be secondary to the formula that is based on partisan political outcomes. In other words, as Governor DeWine said, proportionality, fixed percentages, and fixed outcomes becomes king here.
It does, and again, with that provision as well too, what I would say is I would challenge somebody to tell me how that's inaccurate. They might not like the fact that it's actually telling voters what's happening, but when we talk about this word of gerrymander, which is sort of a hot word these days, and when it comes to this issue, of course, the question always is what is it? And it's a hard concept to define, but what I think everyone universally will say is that it's when you're manipulating district lines to favor one political party over the other. If you have a requirement in the Constitution, which this amendment would put number one on the list, of drawing districts so that one party gets this number of seats and one party gets that number of seats, that is the essence of partisan gerrymandering. You're looking at political data, you're drawing districts so that a certain amount will go to this party and a certain amount will go to that party. And that's why I think the ballot board came to the conclusion, we could say manipulate if we want to, but at the end of the day, this is gerrymandering. And simply because a proviso at the beginning of this thing says to prevent gerrymander from happening doesn't mean that this is actually happening, because as we explained, when you get into the weeds about how this thing actually works, it's requiring gerrymandering.
Well, we like to say around here that candidates, campaigns, and issues matter. Of the 15 districts that are indexed or lean Democrat within the district, in other words, a Democrat candidate you could describe gets a bit of a bump, gets a bit of a head start based on the geography of that area. There's certain red areas of Ohio and certain blue areas of Ohio. That's called geography, not gerrymandering. But when you look very hard at the idea that proportionality determines everything, candidates and campaigns and the issues don't matter, because you're going to be seeing these sprawling districts again. right? Because Senator McCauley said on a podcast, he said, if you hated the snake on the lake, it's coming back, and it's coming back in a big way.
Come back with a vengeance.
Because to reach proportionality, if that's truly what you're drawing maps over, you're going to have some wild-looking districts.
Of course you are, and that's the thing that the reforms that were in 2015 and 2018 were specifically enacted to address is some of the wild-looking districts, i.e. the snake on the lake. That was from 10 years ago that a lot of people were up in arms about. And so the General Assembly and the voters obviously agreed with them, thought we need to address that topic and we need to do it. And so they did it by putting very strict, very specific guidelines around how that can no longer happen. This amendment would obviously get rid of all those restrictions. And so what does that mean? It doesn't put anything back in that would deal with it similarly. So what it means is, I think, is just you were suggesting, based on geography in this state and based on where people choose to live in this state, you have to pull one side out of certain areas in order to make these districts balance out and draw districts so that there's a certain number going this way and a certain number that way, because there's no other way to do it. And I think a lot of people, when they see some of these districts, if they ever get drawn, it would be, well, actually the governor has showed it, honestly, like what they would look like. And the governor explains this issue extremely well. And it's just pulling these, it's like the spoken wheel, honestly, philosophy that people talk about is that, I don't think anybody's going to want to see districts like that, but that's what this amendment would require.
No, it's also very interesting about who's funding the campaign. We talked about $25 million, most of it out-of-state dark money, led by a $6 million contribution from the 1630 Fund, which was established by someone who is not a citizen of the United States of America, much less a resident of the state of Ohio, Hans-Jörg Wyss. And then isn't it extremely interesting that not only the day that the governor called for the special session to address that issue, and at the time putting Joe Biden on the ballot in Ohio, that $6 million contribution came in and then was almost everything spent immediately within the month of July. And then you see the same newspaper editorial boards and reporters out there as well saying, oh, this foreign funds thing, it doesn't happen. You can't prove it. Well, it seems to me when you talk about criminal law, you have to get beyond a reasonable doubt. And if the NDRC's lawyer, Mark Elias, right, who is now part of this lawsuit against the ballot board's vote as well, comes in and challenges and tries to block the foreign funds ban, that should get you, it got me well beyond a reasonable doubt, because if you weren't using foreign money or money that is coming from outside the United States to fund your campaign, why would you sue to block the law? Yeah,
and John, I think of a lot of potentially one of the most unfortunate things about all this is the fact that when you look at all the dollars and the amount of money that's coming in from out of state to fund this, I think sometimes this issue gets portrayed as being a groundswell of folks in Ohio who want to see this process change. I don't think that's the case. I think what you're seeing is, and we just saw on the last campaign finance report, 19 of the $23 million that came in that cycle from out-of-state special interest groups, and we always hear about these dark money groups. It's the darkest of dark money coming from these folks. And so, but then if you add it all up together, what they've raised up to this point, and they're still probably raising some right now too, but what they raised up to that point was $26 million total, 21 of which was from out of state. I don't know anybody out there, and I think probably the overwhelming majority of people in Ohio, I don't think they want to see out-of-state interests coming in and trying to change the way Ohio operates, from a district standpoint or from a fundamental standpoint on things. And there's just, that's all we're seeing right now is out-of-state money coming in, and it's highly unfortunate.
Thanks for tuning in today, and we will see you soon.